Today, I'm going to talk about a crown that was never meant to shine. A crown that did not sparkle with jewels or invite admiration, but instead, rested heavily on the head of a man who ruled in a time when titles were still being invented. This is a calm story, meant to unfold slowly, like footsteps echoing down a long hallway late at night. It is the story of the Iron Crown of the first President King, and the beginning of a rule that tried very hard to be both ordinary and eternal. The Iron Crown did not begin as a symbol. It began as an object, quiet and unremarkable, forged in a workshop that smelled of oil, ash, and warm metal. The blacksmith who shaped it did not know he was shaping history. He worked methodically, without hurry, because the days were long and the nights were longer, and there was no reason to rush. The iron he used came from old tools and broken gates, melted down and made smooth again. It carried no memory of glory, only the steady usefulness of having once held something together. In those days, the land itself had not yet decided what it wanted to be called. Maps were inconsistent. Borders were penciled lightly, and every town believed it was more important than the next. People woke early, slept when they could, and spoke often about stability, even though few had experienced it. The idea of a president king came from this uncertainty, from the desire to blend the familiarity of a ruler with the comfort of a chosen leader. It sounded reasonable enough, and so, it was accepted. The man who would wear the Iron Crown was not born to it. He was not raised in a palace or trained to sit on elevated chairs. His early life was filled with routines that did not seem important at the time. Walking the same roads, greeting the same faces, eating meals that tasted the same every day. These habits, unnoticed then, would later make him appealing to people who feared extremes. He was known for listening longer than necessary, and speaking only when the room had gone quiet. When the assembly first discussed the need for a crown, the conversation was subdued. No one wanted a golden symbol that would remind them too strongly of past monarchies. Gold felt loud. Gold felt demanding. Iron, on the other hand, felt practical. It was honest. It rusted when neglected, just like institutions did. The choice was not celebrated, only agreed upon. And agreement was considered enough. The crown itself was simple, a band of dark metal, slightly uneven, cool to the touch. There were no inscriptions on the outside. On the inside, hidden where only the wearer would feel it, were shallow grooves left by the blacksmith's tools. These grooves pressed gently against the head, a constant reminder that the crown was not separate from the person beneath it. The day the first President King was selected, there were no fireworks. The sky looked the same as it always had. People gathered because they felt they should, not because they were excited. The announcement was read aloud in a steady voice that did not rise or fall. When his name was spoken, it sounded like any other name, familiar and ordinary. That was part of the appeal. Before the crown was placed on his head, the man held it for a moment. Iron is heavier than it appears, and he noticed this immediately. The weight was not painful, but it was persistent. It asked to be acknowledged. He turned it slightly in his hands, observing the dull reflection of light across its surface. There was nothing in it that promised greatness, only responsibility. As the crown was lowered, there was a brief silence. Not ceremonial, but practical. As if everyone present was waiting to see whether something unexpected might happen. Nothing did. The crown settled. The man adjusted his posture slightly, more from instinct than instruction. The moment passed, and history moved forward without announcing itself. The Iron Crown was never meant to command attention. It did not catch the eye from a distance. When the President King walked through halls or stood at podiums, people sometimes forgot he was wearing it at all. This, too, was intentional. The crown was not there to elevate him above others, but to anchor him in place, to keep him from drifting too far into abstraction. In the early months of his rule, the President King continued many of his old routines. He woke early. He read reports slowly. He paused often, not because he was uncertain, but because he believed decisions benefited from silence before they were made. Advisors learned to wait. Meetings stretched gently, without urgency, like afternoons that had nowhere else to go. The iron crown accompanied him everywhere, except in sleep. At night, it rested on a plain wooden stand beside his bed. In the dim light, it looked less like a symbol of authority and more like a tool set aside until morning. Sometimes, before extinguishing the lamp, he would look at it briefly, not with pride or fear, but with the same expression one might give to a clock that would wake them too early. Outside the capital, people spoke of the crown in practical terms. They said it was heavy. They said it was iron. They said it did not shine. This pleased them. Shiny things had disappointed them before. Iron felt dependable, even when it was cold. Stories began to circulate, slowly and without embellishment. Someone knew someone who had seen the crown up close. Someone else had heard that it left a faint mark on the President King's forehead by the end of the day. Whether these details were true did not matter. They made the crown feel real, and reality was comforting. The first President King did not give many speeches about unity or destiny. When he spoke, he talked about procedures, about schedules, about the importance of maintaining roads and records. The Iron Crown sat quietly as he did so, absorbing the sound of his voice, reflecting nothing back. It did not amplify his words. It simply existed. Over time, the crown became associated not with power, but with endurance. It was there during long sessions and uneventful decisions. It was present when nothing dramatic occurred. In a strange way, this made it more significant. It witnessed continuity, which is harder to achieve than triumph. As the first year of the President King's rule unfolded, the Iron Crown remained unchanged. It did not grow more ornate. It did not acquire meaning through ceremony. Its meaning accumulated slowly, through repetition, through the simple act of being worn day after day without incident. And so, the story begins not with conquest or celebration, but with weight, routine, and the steady presence of iron. The Iron Crown of the first President King did not announce a new era. It settled into it quietly, as iron always does. Patient, unmoving, waiting for time to do the rest. The first quiet months. After the Iron Crown was placed on the head of the first President King, nothing immediately changed. This was something many people noticed only later. When they tried to remember what those first weeks had been like, memory searched for events, and found very few. The days seemed to blend together, moving at a steady, almost careful pace. The President King returned to his quarters the evening of the crowning without escort or ceremony. The corridors were quiet. The walls did not echo with applause. The Iron Crown sat firmly, its weight steady, neither shifting nor demanding attention. It did not feel powerful. It felt present. The next morning arrived as mornings always had. Light entered the room gradually. The city outside woke in pieces, rather than all at once. Somewhere, a door closed. Somewhere else, a voice called out. The Iron Crown waited where it had been placed the night before, resting on a plain wooden stand with no decoration. When the President King lifted the crown, he noticed again how solid it felt. Iron does not pretend to be lighter than it is. He placed it on his head without assistance. There was no mirror involved. There was no need to check how it looked. The first official days under the Iron Crown were filled with reading. Reports arrived in stacks, tied neatly, written in careful handwriting. The President King read slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because he believed speed could create mistakes. The crown remained unmoving as his eyes moved from line to line. Meetings were scheduled and kept. People entered rooms, sat down, spoke, and left. The tone was polite and restrained. No one raised their voice. No one attempted to impress. The Iron Crown seemed to encourage this restraint simply by existing, by being heavy enough to remind everyone that excess was unnecessary. Outside the capital, news spread gradually. People heard that there was now a President King. They heard he wore an iron crown. This information settled into conversation without causing much reaction. Iron sounded sensible. It sounded final. Farmers continued to follow the seasons. Shopkeepers opened their doors at the same hours. Roads were traveled at the same pace. If anything had changed, it was subtle enough to escape notice. Under the Iron Crown, life continued without interruption. The President King spent long hours seated, listening. He allowed pauses to stretch longer than others expected. Silence filled rooms, and was not rushed away. The Iron Crown seemed comfortable during these moments, resting quietly, as though silence were one of its natural environments. At midday, meals were simple. Bread. Warm dishes prepared without excess. The President King ate without hurry. He did not speak much while eating. The crown remained on his head, absorbing warmth from the room and the slow passage of time. There were moments when someone would glance at the crown, then quickly look away, as if unsure whether attention was required. Nothing in the crown invited reaction. It did not shine. It did not reflect faces back at themselves. It simply stayed. Paperwork accumulated, and was then reduced. Decisions were made, and recorded. None were dramatic enough to repeat loudly. The Iron Crown oversaw these decisions without comment, without distinction between large matters and small ones. In the evenings, the President King removed the crown with the same care he used in the morning. The absence of its weight was noticeable, but not dramatic. He placed it back on the stand. The room felt quieter, though it already had been quiet before. Sleep came easily during those first months. Dreams were ordinary. Mornings followed nights without resistance. The Iron Crown waited patiently for the next day, unchanged. As weeks passed, people grew used to the idea that leadership could be steady and uneventful. This realization did not excite them, but it allowed them to rest. Under the Iron Crown, nothing demanded urgency. And so, the first quiet months passed, marked not by memory-worthy moments, but by continuity. The Iron Crown did not begin its legacy with spectacle. It began it with repetition, with calm, and with the steady passing of days that asked nothing more than to be lived. The shape of routine. By the time the Iron Crown had been worn for many months, it no longer felt new to anyone who saw it regularly. Familiarity softened its presence. The eye passed over it without stopping, and the mind registered it only as part of the usual arrangement of things. Routine settled in carefully, like dust that accumulates without being noticed. Each day followed the one before it closely enough that they could be mistaken for each other. The President King woke at the same hour. He dressed in the same manner. He lifted the Iron Crown from its stand, and placed it on his head with a motion that no longer required thought. The crown rested as it always had, neither shifting nor pressing more than necessary. Its weight was constant, predictable. This predictability made it easier to forget, and yet impossible to remove from awareness completely. It was there, just enough to be felt. Administrative life under the Iron Crown found its own rhythm. Documents arrived in measured quantities. Requests were reviewed and returned with notes written in calm, even handwriting. Nothing was underlined. Nothing was marked urgently. The Iron Crown observed all of it, in silence. People who worked near the President King learned the value of patience. Meetings did not begin until everyone was seated. They did not end until nothing more needed to be said. Silence was allowed to linger, filling the space between words. The crown seemed to belong most naturally in these pauses. In the wider land, the idea of the President King became something distant, but steady. His name appeared in records and announcements, but his presence did not intrude into daily life. People spoke of him the way they spoke of seasons or roads, as something reliable, but not personal. Occasionally, a small ceremony was suggested, a reminder of leadership or unity. These ideas were discussed and quietly set aside. There was no urgency to mark time with symbols. Time was already passing well enough on its own. The Iron Crown continued to age slowly. Tiny marks appeared along its edge, too small to matter. No one polished them away. The crown was not meant to look new forever. It was meant to last. The President King found himself thinking less about the crown, and more about the space it created. It allowed him to remain still while others spoke. It gave weight to moments that might otherwise drift past. It did not demand action. It simply waited. Afternoons often stretched long and quiet. Light shifted across the room. Papers were rearranged. Chairs were moved slightly, then left where they were. The Iron Crown caught none of the light directly, remaining dark and understated. There were days when nothing of note happened at all. No decisions. No visitors. No changes. These days passed unnoticed, and in time, they became the most common kind of day. Under the Iron Crown, this was considered acceptable. At night, when the crown was removed, the President King sometimes paused before setting it down. Not to reflect deeply, but to acknowledge its presence. The iron was cool by then, holding no warmth. It rested where it was placed, content to remain inactive. Sleep followed easily. Dreams, if remembered at all, were quiet and incomplete. Morning returned without effort. Thus, the shape of routine became the true structure of the President King's rule. Not laws or proclamations, but repetition. Not ambition, but consistency. The Iron Crown remained at the center of this rhythm. Not guiding it, not resisting it. Simply existing as routine made solid. And as routine deepened, the Iron Crown grew less like an object and more like a constant. Something that did not need explanation. Something that was simply there, as the days continued to pass. The long middle. By the time the rule of the first President King reached what people later called its middle years, it became difficult to say exactly when one year ended and the next began. The Iron Crown had been worn so consistently that it no longer felt like a beginning or an outcome. It felt like the center of something already in motion. Days continued to arrive without announcement. Morning followed night with dependable regularity. The President King rose, prepared himself, and lifted the Iron Crown from its resting place. The movement was slow, not out of hesitation but out of habit. Habit had become the strongest force in the room. The crown's weight had not changed, but the body carrying it had learned every small adjustment required to keep balance. Muscles compensated without instruction. The neck aligned itself naturally. There was no strain worth mentioning. Iron, when steady, teaches steadiness in return. The corridors of governance grew quieter during these years. Not emptier, but calmer. People moved through them without urgency. Footsteps echoed softly, and then faded. Doors opened and closed with gentle certainty. The Iron Crown passed through these spaces every day, observing without distinction. Records from this period are extensive, but unremarkable. Page after page details meetings held. Supplies counted. Borders reaffirmed. Agreements renewed exactly as they had been before. Nothing demanded emphasis. Nothing required decoration. The crown was present for all of it, unmoved by repetition. Visitors still arrived from distant regions. Though fewer expected spectacle, word had spread that the President King's court was quiet. Those who came seeking excitement rarely stayed long. Those who came seeking predictability often returned. The Iron Crown appeared the same to everyone who saw it. Dark. Solid. Without ornament. Its surface showed faint signs of use, but no damage. It had not been repaired because it had not needed to be. Iron, when left alone, prefers to remain as it is. The President King spoke even less during this time. Not because he had withdrawn, but because systems had learned to function without constant reinforcement. When he did speak, his words were measured and practical. He did not raise his voice. The crown did not amplify it. Afternoons stretched comfortably. Light shifted across walls and floors. Dust settled, and was later cleared away. Chairs were adjusted by small degrees, and then forgotten. The Iron Crown remained dark against the changing brightness of the room, absorbing, rather than reflecting. There were moments when the President King would pause. Not in thought, but in stillness. These pauses had no purpose beyond existing. The Iron Crown seemed to approve of them by remaining perfectly still. Outside the capital, the land adjusted to a form of leadership that did not interrupt daily life. People learned that stability did not require constant reminders. Roads were repaired when needed. Markets opened and closed at familiar hours. Seasons passed without commentary. Children grew older under the Iron Crown without noticing it. They learned their letters. They learned their numbers. The name of the President King appeared briefly in lessons, and then disappeared behind more immediate concerns. The crown did not feature in their games or stories. The blacksmith who had forged the Iron Crown continued his work. His days filled with predictable tasks. If he ever thought of the crown, it was only in passing. Iron was iron. Once shaped, it did its job quietly. Within the President King's chambers, the crown's stand remained in the same place. Year after year. The wood beneath it darkened slightly with age. The space around it became familiar, defined more by absence at night than by presence during the day. At times, advisors wondered whether the crown should be replaced or renewed, if only to mark the passage of time. These discussions never lasted long. The Iron Crown was not a marker of change. It was a marker of continuation. The President King felt no attachment to the crown beyond acknowledgement. He did not think of it as an extension of himself. It was a responsibility made visible. Nothing more. When he removed it each evening, he did so without ceremony. Sleep during these years was deep and regular. Dreams were rarely remembered. Mornings arrived without resistance. The Iron Crown waited patiently through each night. Unchanged. Years passed in this way, gently stacking upon one another. The middle of the rule stretched longer than anyone expected. It was not dramatic enough to remember clearly, and so, it seemed endless while it lasted. The Iron Crown did not age dramatically. It dulled slightly. It accumulated history without acquiring meaning beyond what it already had. It was present, and that was enough. Those who later wrote about this period struggled to describe it. There were no defining events to emphasize, no turning points to circle. They used words like steady, uneventful, and consistent, repeating them until they lost distinction. The President King continued to attend meetings, review documents, and listen. He did not attempt to shape a legacy. The Iron Crown did not ask him to. It remained what it had always been, a quiet reminder that power could exist without display. The land settled into itself. Expectations lowered. Anxiety softened. Under the Iron Crown, the absence of urgency became normal. And so, the long middle of the rule passed, made of ordinary mornings, quiet afternoons, and evenings that ended exactly as they began. The Iron Crown remained at the center of it all, not as a symbol of greatness, but as proof that time could move forward without disturbance. The weight that stayed. As the years under the Iron Crown continued, people stopped counting them carefully. Numbers still appeared on documents, but they no longer carried much emotional weight. Time had settled into a flat, even shape, where one year felt much like the next. The Iron Crown remained at the center of this shape, unchanged and uncomplaining. The President King woke one morning and realized he could no longer remember what it felt like to live without the crown. This realization did not trouble him. It arrived quietly, stayed for a moment, and then passed. The iron had become part of the background of his existence, like gravity, or the sound of his own breathing. Each morning followed the same sequence. Light filtered in. The city stirred gradually. The iron crown waited on its stand. He lifted it, felt its familiar weight, and placed it on his head. There was no pause for reflection. The action had become as ordinary as putting on shoes. The crown's surface was cooler in the early hours, warming slightly as the day progressed. This was one of the few changes the President-King noticed. Iron responds to the environment without commentary. It absorbs, adjusts, and remains. Inside the administrative halls, work continued without urgency. Papers were sorted. Records were updated. Meetings were held, and concluded with minimal variation. People spoke calmly, aware that nothing needed to be rushed. The Iron Crown presided over these exchanges without influencing them, except by reminding everyone that steadiness was acceptable. Occasionally, someone new would arrive, unfamiliar with the rhythm of the place. They might speak too quickly, or gesture too broadly. These moments resolved themselves naturally. The quiet of the room absorbed excess energy. The Iron Crown remained unmoved, and the room followed its example. Outside the capital, the land aged gently. Roads wore down and were repaired. Buildings darkened slightly with time. Fields changed color with the seasons. Under the Iron Crown, none of these changes felt symbolic. They were simply processes, continuing as they always had. The President-King traveled rarely, and when he did, there was little ceremony. The crown came with him, resting steadily as landscapes passed slowly by. People along the roads sometimes noticed it, sometimes did not. Either reaction was acceptable. When he returned to the capital, nothing awaited him except continuity. His chair was where he left it. His papers remained in order. The Iron Crown resumed its familiar path through familiar rooms. There were moments of quiet fatigue, though they were not dramatic. The weight of the crown did not increase, but the years beneath it accumulated. The President-King did not complain. He rested when he could. The crown did not object. In private moments, he sometimes touched the edge of the iron absent-mindedly, feeling its texture. The metal was smooth in places, rougher in others. These imperfections were not flaws. They were evidence of use, of time applied steadily, rather than forcefully. The idea of legacy surfaced occasionally in conversation, usually from advisors who felt responsible for thinking about such things. The President-King listened politely. The Iron Crown offered no guidance. In the end, legacy was discussed less and less. It felt unnecessary to name something that was already happening quietly. Children who had grown up entirely under the Iron Crown reached adulthood. To them, the President-King had always existed, and the crown had always been iron. They found this normal. They found it difficult to imagine alternatives. Teachers spoke of earlier times briefly, without detail. The Iron Crown belonged to the present, and the present required little explanation. History lessons moved past it without emphasis. The crown itself aged slowly. Its edges softened just slightly. Its surface dulled in a way that could only be seen if one looked closely. No one suggested polishing it. Brightness would have felt out of place. At night, the President-King removed the crown as he always had. The stand received it. The room adjusted. Sleep arrived. The pattern repeated. There were long stretches when nothing interrupted this cycle. Weeks passed. Months blended together. The Iron Crown remained exactly where it was meant to be. The President-King did not feel powerful. He felt occupied. His days were filled, not with ambition, but with attention. Attention to detail. Attention to process. Attention to continuity. The crown rested quietly, as if confirming that this was sufficient. Occasionally, Distant rumors reached the capital. Some spoke of change elsewhere. Some spoke of unrest in lands far beyond the borders. These reports were noted, discussed briefly, and filed. The Iron Crown did not respond to speculation. The land under its influence remained calm, not because it was controlled tightly, but because it was left largely undisturbed. Stability had become habitual. As time continued its steady movement, the Iron Crown proved itself not through action, but through persistence. It did not shine. It did not inspire awe. It remained. The President-King sometimes wondered, vaguely, how long this would continue. The thought carried no urgency. The Iron Crown had never suggested an ending. And so, the years continued, shaped by routine, held together by iron, and softened by the absence of drama. The weight stayed. The days passed. The Iron Crown remained, steady and unchanged, as time moved forward around it, without asking for permission. When time became soft. At some point during the later years of the first President-King's rule, time itself seemed to lose its edges. Days no longer felt like distinct units that began and ended. Instead, they blended gently into one another, forming long stretches of sameness that were neither unpleasant nor remarkable. The Iron Crown remained at the center of this softened time, unchanged and quietly persistent. The President-King continued to wake before the city reached full awareness. Morning light entered the room in familiar patterns, touching the same corners, and leaving the same shadows. The Iron Crown rested on its stand, waiting without expectation. He lifted it, placed it on his head, and felt the familiar pressure settle into place. There was no longer any thought attached to this action. It happened because it always had. The crown fit as it always had. Iron does not surprise, once it has been accepted. The body beneath the crown had aged, though not dramatically. Movements were slightly slower, but also more precise. Each step had learned where to land. Each turn of the head accounted for the crown's weight without conscious effort. The iron remained steady, indifferent to these gradual changes. Inside the halls of governance, the atmosphere remained calm. The same chairs were used. The same tables bore the same faint marks from years of contact. The same papers were spread out and gathered again. The Iron Crown passed through these spaces daily. Its presence no longer noted aloud. People spoke softly, not because they were instructed to, but because loudness felt unnecessary. Conversations unfolded at a measured pace. Pauses were accepted without discomfort. Silence was no longer something to be filled. It was simply part of the room. The President-King listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was to clarify rather than persuade. His words were brief and practical. The Iron Crown did not change its position in response. It never had. Outside the capital, the land continued to exist without interruption. Seasons followed their established order. Crops grew, were harvested, and grew again. Roads were worn down and repaired. Under the Iron Crown, none of this was framed as progress or decline. It was simply continuation. The idea of the President-King became increasingly abstract to those who lived far away. He was known to exist, known to wear an iron crown, and known to preside over a quiet system. This knowledge was sufficient. Few felt the need to know more. In the capital, newer generations of workers replaced older ones. Positions changed hands without ceremony. The systems remained. The Iron Crown remained. Knowledge was passed along quietly, without emphasis on who had first established it. The crown itself showed signs of long use. Its surface was no longer uniform. Time had smoothed some areas and roughened others. The edges were softer than they had once been. These changes were subtle enough that only those who handled the crown regularly would notice them. The President King noticed, occasionally. When he removed the crown in the evening, he sometimes turned it slightly in his hands. Not with curiosity, but with recognition. The iron felt familiar. Its imperfections felt earned. Sleep remained regular. Dreams, if they came, were vague and unimportant. Morning followed night without resistance. The Iron Crown waited patiently through every dark hour. During these years, fewer questions were asked about the future. The present seemed adequate. Planning still occurred, but it was practical rather than visionary. The Iron Crown did not encourage grand designs. It supported maintenance. There were no significant reforms announced. No sweeping changes were introduced. This absence of transformation became a defining characteristic of the era, though few noticed it while living through it. Occasionally, distant reports arrived describing upheaval elsewhere. These were read carefully and discussed calmly. Preparations were made if needed, but without alarm. The Iron Crown did not react to distant noise. The President King felt no urgency to respond dramatically to anything. He trusted the systems that had been built slowly over time. The crown rested heavily but steadily, reinforcing patience rather than action. In private moments, the President King sometimes sat without reading or speaking. He allowed time to pass unmeasured. The Iron Crown remained on his head, its weight a quiet companion rather than a burden. The rooms around him aged as well. Wood darkened. Stone smoothed where hands passed often. Light fixtures dimmed slightly. These changes were gradual enough to feel natural. People who had once been children under the Iron Crown now had children of their own. To them, this period felt normal. Stability was not something they questioned. It was simply the condition of the world they knew. The idea of an ending did not arise often. When it did, it felt distant and theoretical. The Iron Crown had never suggested finality. It suggested duration. Evenings remained quiet. The crown was removed. The stand received it. The room settled. Sleep followed. Years passed in this softened way, without edges sharp enough to mark. The Iron Crown continued to exist exactly as it had been designed to. Heavy, plain, and enduring. The President King did not feel remembered or forgotten. He felt present. The crown did not define him. It accompanied him. And so, time continued to move. Not quickly, not slowly, but steadily. Under the Iron Crown, time became something that did not demand attention. It simply passed, leaving behind no sharp memories. Only the quiet assurance that continuity was still intact. The quiet nearing. As the later years settled in, there was no clear signal to announce that time had advanced. Nothing rang. Nothing shifted suddenly. The Iron Crown remained where it had always been. And because of that, everything else felt as though it remained in place as well. The President King continued his mornings as he always had. Light entered the room softly, touching familiar surfaces. The Iron Crown rested on its stand, unchanged in shape, unchanged in purpose. He lifted it carefully, though not reverently, and placed it on his head. The motion was slower now, but also more certain. The weight of the crown felt the same as ever. Iron does not grow heavier with age. The body beneath it, however, had learned to move differently. Movements were deliberate, economical. Nothing was wasted. The crown remained steady, as if approving of efficiency. The capital had grown accustomed to this pace. Sounds were muted. Even crowded areas seemed restrained. People spoke quietly, walked steadily, and waited without complaint. The Iron Crown passed through these spaces without drawing attention, just as it always had. Meetings continued, though they were shorter now. Not because there was less to discuss, but because understanding came more quickly. Systems no longer needed explanation. Everyone knew their role. The Iron Crown presided over these moments with quiet indifference. Documents still arrived, though fewer required revision. Processes had settled into reliable patterns. The President-King read slowly, marking only what truly needed marking. The crown remained dark and unreflective above him. Outside the capital, the land continued to exist without interruption. People woke, worked, rested, and slept. Crops were planted and harvested. Roads were maintained. Under the Iron Crown, life had learned not to expect disruption. Children growing up during this time did not think of the President-King as new or old. He simply was. The Iron Crown, too, simply was. There was comfort in this constancy, though it was rarely discussed. The crown itself bore the evidence of long use. Its surface was dulled. Its edges softened. It had been touched by countless mornings and evenings. These changes were subtle, almost invisible, but they were there. The President-King noticed these details occasionally, while removing the crown at night. He did not dwell on them. Iron changes slowly. So did everything else. There were moments when advisors spoke carefully about preparation, about continuity beyond the present. These conversations were calm, factual, and free of emotion. The Iron Crown did not respond. It had never suggested what came next. The President-King listened. He nodded. He allowed silence to follow. Decisions were noted and filed, not emphasized. The crown remained steady, its weight unchanged. Evenings grew quieter, if that was possible. The removal of the crown became a slower ritual, though still without ceremony. The stand received it as it always had. The room adjusted. Sleep came gently. Dreams were faint and rarely remembered. Morning followed without resistance. The idea that something was approaching existed only in hindsight. At the time, everything felt the same. The Iron Crown did not announce transitions. It did not signal endings. The city continued to function smoothly. People came and went. Positions changed hands. Knowledge passed quietly from one person to the next. The Iron Crown remained above it all. Not overseeing. Not directing. Simply present. The President-King spent more time listening than speaking. When he spoke, his words were fewer, but clear. The crown did not move. There were long stretches when nothing notable happened at all. These stretches blended together, forming a calm, uninterrupted flow. Under the Iron Crown, this had become the expected state of things. Somewhere in the records, clerks began using phrases like later years without specifying dates. Precision felt unnecessary. Time had softened enough that exactness no longer mattered. The Iron Crown continued to do what it had always done. It remained iron. It remained heavy. It remained plain. The President-King did not feel anticipation or regret. He felt continuity. The crown was not a reminder of power or legacy. It was a reminder of duration. As days continued to pass, quietly, and without resistance, the Iron Crown stayed in place, unchanged, patient, and unmoving, as the rule it represented approached its quiet, unannounced edge, without ever naming it. The days that continued. There was no clear moment when one could say that the rule under the Iron Crown entered a new phase. The days continued in the same manner they always had, moving forward without pause or announcement. If anything had changed, it was subtle enough to remain unnoticed. The President-King woke as he always did, before the city reached full awareness. Morning light entered the room quietly, settling into familiar places. The Iron Crown rested on its stand, unchanged in form and presence. He lifted it slowly, placed it on his head, and felt the same steady weight settle into position. The crown did not feel older. Iron does not carry age the way living things do. It remained heavy, plain, and dependable. The body beneath it moved with careful familiarity. Every motion adjusted to accommodate what had long been there. Inside the administrative halls, activity continued at a calm pace. People arrived, took their places, and began their work without urgency. The sounds of the building remained subdued. Footsteps, pages turning, low voices. The Iron Crown passed through these spaces daily, its presence no longer requiring recognition. Meetings unfolded with minimal variation. Topics were addressed. Notes were taken. Decisions were recorded. Silence was allowed to stretch comfortably between exchanges. The crown remained unmoving, as if perfectly suited to these unhurried moments. Outside the capital, life continued in its steady patterns. Fields changed color with the seasons. Markets opened and closed. Roads carried travelers at familiar speeds. Under the Iron Crown, these rhythms were uninterrupted. People spoke less often about leadership, and more often about weather, harvests, and small concerns. The President-King existed in the background of their lives, reliable and distant. The Iron Crown, too, existed without demanding attention. The crown's surface showed the quiet history of use. Slight variations in texture could be felt by hand, though they were barely visible. These were not signs of wear, so much as signs of persistence. Iron changes slowly, and only when time insists. In the evenings, the President-King removed the crown and placed it on its stand. The absence of its weight was familiar, expected. The room adjusted. Night settled in without effort. Sleep came easily. Dreams, when they appeared, were vague, and without narrative. Morning returned as it always did. The idea of change remained distant. Planning continued, but it focused on maintenance, rather than transformation. The Iron Crown did not encourage boldness. It supported consistency. New generations entered roles once held by others. They learned the systems quietly, without ceremony. Knowledge transferred smoothly, without emphasis on beginnings or endings. The crown remained the same through all of it. The President-King spent long hours listening, reading, and sitting in stillness. These moments were not empty. They were simply unfilled. The Iron Crown rested above him, unchanged by the passage of thought. Time continued to soften. Dates mattered less. Sequences mattered more. One day followed another, each resembling the last closely enough to feel continuous, rather than separate. The city aged gently. Stone smoothed. Wood darkened. Light shifted slightly year by year. These changes were slow enough to feel natural. The Iron Crown remained dark and solid against this gradual transformation. There were no announcements, no signals, no markers to indicate progression. Under the Iron Crown, time did not demand recognition. The President-King did not reflect often on the past or the future. His attention remained on the present moment, which required very little from him. The crown did not ask for more. Days continued. Mornings arrived. Evenings settled. The Iron Crown remained where it had always been, steady and quiet, as the story moved forward without pause, without conclusion, and without any need to stop. The steady, unnamed present. The continuation of days did not feel like continuation at all. It felt like stillness that happened to move. Under the Iron Crown, the present did not stand out from what had come before it. Nor did it suggest anything ahead. It simply existed, wide and even, without edges. The President-King woke as usual, without urgency. Morning entered the room quietly, resting on surfaces that had grown familiar over many years. The Iron Crown waited on its stand, unchanged, He lifted it with the same measured motion, and placed it on his head, where it settled without resistance. The crown's weight was neither noticed nor ignored. It was acknowledged in the same way one acknowledges the ground beneath their feet. It was there. It had always been there. The halls of administration opened to another day of ordinary activity. People arrived, took their seats, and began working without ceremony. There was no need for instruction. Everyone knew what was expected. The Iron Crown moved through the space as it always had. Silent and steady. Meetings unfolded slowly. Words were exchanged only when needed. Long pauses filled the space between statements. These pauses were not awkward. They were accepted as part of the structure of discussion. The crown remained still during them, as though designed for silence. Documents were reviewed and returned to their places. Nothing required urgency. Notes were written carefully, without emphasis. The Iron Crown remained dark against the light of the room, absorbing rather than reflecting. Outside the capital, the land followed its familiar rhythms. The passage of seasons was felt, more than seen. Changes arrived gently, and departed without announcement. Under the Iron Crown, no moment insisted on being remembered. People spoke less about governance, and more about routine concerns. The President-King existed in their understanding as a constant, not a presence that demanded thought. The Iron Crown existed the same way. The crown itself bore the quiet evidence of time. Its surface was no longer uniform. Subtle variations could be felt by those who handled it regularly. These changes did not weaken it. They softened it. Evenings arrived without drama. The President-King removed the crown and placed it on its stand. The room adjusted. The absence of weight was familiar and temporary. Night settled in naturally. Sleep followed without resistance. Dreams, if they appeared, lacked detail. Morning returned in the same way it always had. The idea of progress rarely surfaced. Maintenance was the focus. Continuity was the goal. The Iron Crown supported this without instruction. New faces appeared in familiar roles. Old faces departed quietly. The transition was smooth enough to escape notice. The systems remained unchanged. The crown remained unchanged. The President-King spent long periods in stillness. Not waiting. Not thinking. Simply being present. The Iron Crown rested above him. Steady and unremarkable. Time continued without markers. Days followed days. Weeks blended into longer stretches. Under the Iron Crown, the present expanded, rather than moved forward. The city continued to age gently. Surfaces smoothed. Colors faded slightly. These changes were slow enough to feel permanent, rather than temporary. The Iron Crown remained dark and solid against this gradual shift. There was no sense of nearing or departing. There was only continuation. The crown did not signal anything else. And so, the days continued, indistinguishable from one another, steady and quiet, as the Iron Crown remained in place, and time moved forward without interruption, without conclusion, and without any need to pause. The familiar ongoing. Nothing announced the arrival of another stretch of time. It arrived the way all the others had, quietly, and without distinction. Under the Iron Crown, the passing of days no longer felt like movement from one place to another. It felt like remaining where one already was. The President-King woke again before the city reached full awareness. Morning light entered the room softly, touching the same surfaces it always had. The walls held the light without reaction. The Iron Crown rested on its stand, unchanged and patient. He lifted the crown slowly, not because it was heavy, but because there was no reason to move quickly. The iron settled onto his head with the same familiar pressure. Exact. and unremarkable. There was no adjustment needed. There rarely was any more. The body beneath the crown moved carefully through the morning routine. Each motion had been practiced many times. Clothing was arranged. The room was left as it always was. The iron crown remained steady, neither guiding nor resisting. In the administrative halls, the day unfolded in its usual manner. People arrived quietly. Chairs were pulled back and then returned to their places. Papers were arranged, read, and stacked again. The sounds were soft and predictable. Meetings began without announcement and ended without ceremony. Words were exchanged only when necessary. Silence filled the spaces between them comfortably. The Iron Crown remained present through it all, unmoved by the passage of conversation. The President-King listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were brief and practical. There was no emphasis placed on them. They were absorbed into the room and written down if needed. The crown did not react. Time inside these rooms moved differently than it did elsewhere. Though the difference was subtle, it did not rush. It did not linger. It simply continued at a steady pace that required no attention. Outside the capital, life carried on in the same quiet patterns. People rose, worked, rested, and slept. Seasons passed without commentary. Fields changed gradually. Roads aged and were repaired. Under the Iron Crown, none of this felt symbolic. The President-King's name appeared on documents and announcements, but rarely in conversation. He was understood to exist, to preside, and to continue. The Iron Crown shared this quiet understanding. The crown itself showed the accumulated evidence of long use. Its surface had softened slightly. Edges that were once sharp were now gently rounded. These changes did not weaken it. They made it more familiar to the hand. In the evenings, the President-King removed the crown with the same care he always had. He placed it on its stand, exactly where it belonged. The room adjusted subtly to its absence. Night settled in without effort. Sleep arrived gently. Dreams, when they came, were indistinct and quickly forgotten. Morning returned without resistance, as it always did. Days continued to pass without calling attention to themselves. Weeks blended into longer stretches. The Iron Crown remained a constant presence, unchanged by the slow movement of time around it. Occasionally, someone new would remark on the quietness of the place. These comments were acknowledged politely, and then allowed to fade. Quiet had long since become normal. The President-King spent increasing amounts of time in stillness, not because there was nothing to do, but because stillness had become part of the work. The Iron Crown rested above him, steady and unremarkable. The city continued to age in small, nearly invisible ways. Stone smoothed where hands passed often. Wood darkened. Light shifted slightly as years accumulated. These changes were gradual enough to feel permanent. Children grew older under this unbroken rhythm. They learned routines without questioning them. The Iron Crown existed in their understanding as something that had always been there. No one spoke of beginnings. No one spoke of endings. The present expanded quietly, filling all available space. The Iron Crown did not demand remembrance. It did not encourage anticipation. It remained iron, plain, and heavy, exactly as it had always been. And so, the days continued, flowing one into the next without interruption, without emphasis, and without any sense of needing to stop. As the Iron Crown stayed in place, and time continued its steady, uneventful movement, forward, the unbroken stretch, the days did not announce themselves anymore. They arrived quietly, settled into place, and passed on without leaving a clear outline behind. Under the Iron Crown, time had become something wide and flat. something that extended, rather than progressed. The President King woke again, as he had so many times before. The room greeted him with familiar stillness. Morning light entered without urgency, touching the same surfaces, creating the same soft contrasts of light and shadow. The iron crown rested on its stand, unchanged, waiting. He lifted it slowly, feeling the same balanced weight in his hands. There was no hesitation. There was no reflection. The crown was placed on his head, and it settled exactly where it always had, neither shifting, nor pressing more than necessary. The iron was cool at first, warming gradually as the morning continued. This change was subtle and predictable. Iron responds to contact without complaint. The President King moved through his routine with the same measured care, leaving the room as he always did. The halls of governance opened into another day of quiet continuity. People arrived in small groups or alone. Footsteps echoed briefly, and then faded. Chairs were moved slightly, and then left alone. Papers were set down, lifted, and returned to their places. Conversations began softly, and ended without ceremony. There was no need to summarize what had been said. Everyone understood. Silence filled the spaces between words, unchallenged and accepted. The Iron Crown remained steady throughout, its presence neither emphasized nor ignored. Meetings unfolded at a pace that felt almost timeless. No one checked the time unnecessarily. No one hurried to conclude. The Iron Crown seemed well suited to this pace, resting above the room as if designed for it. The President King listened carefully. His attention moved from speaker to speaker without urgency. When he spoke, it was to clarify or confirm, not to persuade. His words were absorbed into the quiet structure of the room. The crown did not react. Outside the capital, the land continued its familiar rhythms. Fields responded to seasons. Roads carried travelers at steady speeds. Towns opened and closed their doors according to habits long established. Under the Iron Crown, none of this required adjustment. People spoke of their daily concerns without reference to leadership. The President King existed as a constant, not as a presence that demanded attention. The Iron Crown existed the same way, quietly assumed. The crown itself continued to change slowly, though the changes were barely visible. Its surface held the memory of countless days, each one leaving a mark too small to matter on its own. Together, these marks softened the iron without weakening it. In the evenings, the President King removed the crown with the same practiced motion. The stand received it. The room adjusted slightly. Night arrived without ceremony. Sleep followed naturally. Dreams were faint and unstructured. Morning returned without resistance. Days passed in this manner, one after another, without distinction. The Iron Crown remained steady through them all, its presence unaltered by repetition. Within the capital, generations overlapped quietly. Older workers stepped aside. Newer ones took their places. Knowledge transferred smoothly, without announcement. The systems remained intact. The crown remained intact. The President King spent long periods sitting in stillness. These moments were not empty. They were simply unoccupied. The Iron Crown rested above him, its weight familiar and unremarkable. Time no longer felt like something that moved forward. It felt like something that continued outward, expanding gently. Under the Iron Crown, there was no need to measure it closely. The city aged gradually. Surfaces smoothed. Colors softened. Light shifted almost imperceptibly year by year. These changes were slow enough to feel permanent. No one spoke of transitions. No one asked what came next. The present was sufficient. The Iron Crown did not suggest otherwise. Occasionally, A distant report would arrive describing activity elsewhere. These were read carefully, and then set aside. The Iron Crown did not respond to distant movement. The President King acknowledged these reports with calm attention. He trusted the systems that had carried the land this far. The crown rested quietly, offering no instruction. Evenings remained quiet. The removal of the crown marked the end of the day, though not in a dramatic way. The stand held it. The room darkened. Sleep arrived. Morning returned again. The cycle continued without interruption. Days layered themselves gently, one upon another. Without emphasis, the Iron Crown remained at the center of it all, unchanged and unremarkable. There was no sense of arrival. There was no sense of departure. There was only continuation. And so, the unbroken stretch of time went on, steady and calm, with the Iron Crown remaining exactly where it had always been. As the days continued to pass quietly, without conclusion, and without any need to stop, the iron set down. The continuation of days did not feel different at first. Morning arrived as it always had, quietly, and without insistence. Light entered the room, and settled where it always did. The walls held it patiently. The air remained still. The Iron Crown rested on its stand. For a long moment, nothing happened. The President King sat at the edge of the bed, not thinking about the day ahead, not thinking about the years behind. Thought itself had grown quieter over time, less inclined to move quickly from one place to another. The crown waited, as it always had, without expectation. When he lifted it, the weight felt familiar, but his hands noticed it more clearly than before, not because it was heavier, but because his awareness had slowed enough to acknowledge it fully. Iron is patient. It allows itself to be noticed when attention lingers. He placed the crown on his head, and it settled into position with the same steady certainty it always had. There was no shift, no adjustment. The iron rested as if it had never been anywhere else. The day unfolded in its usual manner. The halls opened. People arrived. Work began without announcement. Conversations moved slowly, with long pauses that no one felt compelled to fill. The Iron Crown passed through the rooms one more time. Steady and unremarkable. Meetings occurred. Notes were taken. Decisions were recorded with calm handwriting. Nothing urgent demanded attention. Nothing new insisted on being introduced. The systems continued to function as they had learned to function. Quietly and reliably. The President King spoke very little that day. He listened, nodded, and allowed silence to do most of the work. The crown remained still above him, absorbing sound without reflecting it. Outside the capital, the land continued as it always had. Fields shifted gently in the light. Roads carried travelers at familiar speeds. Markets opened and closed without concern for symbolism. Under the Iron Crown, life had learned how to continue without interruption. As afternoon softened into evening, the light changed gradually. Shadows lengthened. The rooms grew quieter. People departed in the same unhurried way they always had. The President King returned to his chambers without escort. The corridors were calm. Footsteps echoed briefly, and then disappeared. The Iron Crown remained steady, its weight unchanged. When he entered the room, he did not immediately remove the crown. He stood for a moment, not reflecting, not remembering, simply standing. The room waited. Then, with the same practiced motion he had used for years, he lifted the Iron Crown from his head. The absence of its weight was noticeable, but gentle. The air felt slightly different, though nothing else had changed. He placed the crown on its stand, exactly where it had rested through countless nights before. The iron crown remained there, dark and solid, unchanged by being set down. The President King sat nearby, not watching it, not avoiding it. The crown did not demand attention. It never had. Time passed, without measurement. Later, the room darkened. Night arrived as it always did, without ceremony. Sleep followed naturally, without resistance. Morning returned. The iron crown remained on its stand. The day that followed unfolded quietly. Others arrived. The systems continued. The rooms filled and emptied as they always had. The crown did not move. No announcement was made. No moment was marked. The iron crown did not need to be worn to continue doing what it had always done. It remained. Days passed. The crown stayed where it was placed. Its iron surface unchanged. Its shape steady. People continued their work. Decisions continued to be made. Silence continued to be respected. Over time, the iron crown became less associated with a person, and more associated with continuity itself. It sat quietly, witnessing nothing in particular. Present, without participating. The land adjusted without effort. Children grew older. Others took on responsibilities they had once observed. Knowledge passed from one voice to another without emphasis on origins. The iron crown remained iron. It did not rust dramatically. It did not shine. It did not disappear. It rested, and in resting, it completed its purpose. Not by ending, not by triumph, but by proving that stability could exist without display, that leadership could be quiet, and that time could pass gently, when nothing insisted on interrupting it. The days continued. The iron crown stayed where it had been set down, and the story, having moved steadily, and without urgency for so long, did not stop, so much as settle, becoming part of the background, like iron itself, solid, plain, and finally, at rest. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more videos.